Hi, and welcome to the Auspol Weekly video at The Independents. I'm Kim Wingerei, author and commentator, and today I'm talking to Michael West, journo, father and surfer, as he likes to refer to himself. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Kim. Actually, it's not quite in that order. It's father, then surfer, then journalist. Got to get your priorities right.
That makes a lot. Yeah, apologies for that. I'll make sure I get that right next time. Now, you have a long history of investigative journalism behind you, and it's one of the leading lights of independent media at michaelwest.com.au. So what made you go solo after many years in the mainstream media? I'm pretty sure it wasn't for the money, was it?
Well, they sacked me, Kim. I had no choice. And 3 days later, I went into a little bit of a depression for 3 days, thinking, as anybody would, about your self-worth and all that kind of thing. And then I realized they'd done me a huge favor when I went on Twitter and had thousands of retweets. And I decided that day, 3 days later, that I'd strike out on my own. And I'm totally unsuited to any other job. It's the only thing I've been vaguely good at. And so despite the fact that nobody had done this, particularly in the way that I've done it, being an independent journalist, doing big corporate investigations and so on, which is a hairy legal situation to be in, it's worked. It's 3 years down the track now to this month.
Yeah, fantastic. And I can see on our independent media index that your site is growing from strength to strength every month, which is great. So how different is it seeing the world from outside the protections of a large newsroom?
Well, it's vastly different. I mean, the actual job of the central job, that is, of gathering news, that's talking to people, reading things, looking for angles, investigating things, and then writing it. So the writing it takes 20%, and the 80%, gathering and chatting to people, or probably more. That's one thing, and that's what I used to do: gather news and write it. And now it's slightly more complicated because I'm now a small businessman. I've got to find money somewhere to put food on the table. I'm on my own when it comes to getting lawsuits threatened, which I've had a couple. There are some great things about it. You don't have a bureaucracy which you have to deal with, or bosses who have bosses who are trying to shut them down and are being interfered with editorially by large corporations and PR people and lawyers. So the independence is good. I mean, I don't get many complaints simply because I'm also the complaints department manager. So I think a lot of people think it's probably worth complaining. But of course, if I do make a mistake, and everyone makes mistakes, I try and correct it or clarify it or tweak it or apologise for it if it's a grievous error immediately and move on.
Yes. I guess not having a corporate structure behind you with a big balance sheet, this can be a bit daunting. Now, Michael, one of your recurring themes in your writing is the intersection between big business and government, and the corruption and undue influence that business wields over government policy and government action. Now, I recently happened to watch the movie classic Mr. Smith Goes to Washington about corruption in Washington in the 1930s, which was really a stark reminder that there is nothing new about any of this. But is it getting worse, particularly here in Australia? Is it getting worse, you think?
Well, I think it's much more organised. I did a research project 18 months, 2 years ago on the lobby industry in Australia, and it turns out it's $1 billion industry. I mean, every sector now, whether it's gaming or fossil fuels, coal or banking and finance, big pharma, they have a range of peak bodies, associations, lobby groups. They also use specific external lobby firms that ex-politicians and so on to get access, like Christopher Pyne, for instance, and Julie Bishop, what they're doing, to get access to politicians. And you've also got in-house government relations specialists. But combined, if you add up, I went and downloaded all the corporate searches for these main lobby outfits and associations, and added up all the revenue and so on. And these are tax exempt mostly. We're talking $1 billion worth of money spent a year in Australia on basically persuading politicians to see it their way. That's an immense amount of money. I mean, if you do it per parliamentarian, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. So per federal politician. There are a lot of governments, of course, but this is a powerful industry, and the actual money isn't as important as the human relations, I've found. I mean, I think sometimes the political donations narrative is overplayed a bit, because ultimately politicians will listen to voters, particularly when it's close to an election, if the noise is strong enough, rather than somebody who's given them a $2,000 check. But nonetheless, it's, to your original point, inequality, we know, is growing. It's growing over a 70-year period, where the amount of wealth created by economies has gone, the preponderance of it is going to capital rather than to labour. Now we've got this huge issue on our hands about the fact that wages are stagnating. Automation, of course, plays a part as well. But, you know, it seems to me that capital is now much more organised, and they do get their way. And I think there's a feeling of disenchantment that's growing with that in the political process. And that's why people are so angry with politicians, particularly when they say there's a scandal daily. Today it was something to do with tampering with official documents. That was the thing I saw today on Twitter. You know, somebody basically changing the narrative because there was an independent government inquiry done. They didn't like the narrative. So there doesn't seem to be any accountability. People think, oh, we only get the chance to vote for these guys once every 3 years. The rest of the time, somebody else is running the show. And so really my role I see as being able to look at the relationships, look at the power of these vested interests and shed some light on it. Yes.
And in that sense, your recent writings about Watergate, our very own Watergate, the uncovering of suspicious deals between the government and business in the Murray-Darling caused quite a stir. I think you were even threatened with defamation by a lawyer representing Angus Taylor. What has happened since? And not just about that, but in general, what has happened since then? I know you've been kept writing about it.
Well, it's nothing. I mean, there are two types of defamation threat, really, and one is the sort of the gag tactic, which this one was, which is just, let's just shut this down. Let's get these guys, the critics, to shut up, and so we'll get a lawyer to send them a threatening letter saying we're going to come around and shoot your dog unless you pay our legal fares, and you've done our client grievous harm, and his reputation has been shot to pieces because of the terrible things you've written, and it's private and confidential, by the way. You can't tell anybody, but we will drag you through the court and make your life a misery if you don't retract what you're saying. That's the one kind. And the other kind is where somebody has been deliberately hurt or feels hurt, that it may be true, but they still come after you. Of course, these laws, defamation laws, favour wealthy people who've got money to spend on lawyers, who can afford to spend money shutting some adverse comment down. So they're grossly unfair. They should be reformed immediately. And in my view, they're a greater threat to freedom of speech than media raids.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that a bit later. I just want to stay with the Murray-Darling and Watergate for a moment. Of course, there have been many calls for a Royal Commission into it. And of course, there also was a Royal Commission in South Australia with lots of recommendations that really haven't been followed through. But is another Royal Commission the answer, you think?
Well, I think so. Royal Commissions have, judicial powers. They're independent. And they've got terrific powers to be able to subpoena people and get information, and they're always public, generally public, so you can, all the the dirty information gets out there, and generally they may not result in, the Banking Law Commission may not result in many high-profile prosecutions. I doubt that it will, but the pageantry around it will have some cathartic effect in affecting people's behaviour, in being able to condition behaviour or to impose some restraint on the banking sector. It'll do the same thing with Watergate. With Watergate, the central question remains $80 million of taxpayer money, which per litre was the largest payment made by any government to a company which Angus Taylor, the minister, federal government minister, had founded. He must know, or probably should know, who the shareholders are. We need to know who got this money. That information is still not available. The government must know. They can't be giving $80 million away without knowing who they're giving it to. So where is that information? And there's going to be a dark and stormy cloud over this whole Watergate affair, even though it's gone quiet for now. It leaves question marks over the integrity of government, which aren't resolved, and it just further weakens people's credibility in government. These are people in elected positions who've been elected to serve Australians, all 26 million of us. But we've all got the view that they look like they're serving themselves. And so that's not getting any better.
Yeah. And that's also an example of where there are, you know, around the edges, there are lots of kind of straightforward, common sense solutions here. The fact that the Australian government could deal directly with a company registered in the Cayman Island, the best known tax haven in the world outside of Panama, is, to me, it's just absolutely astonishing. I mean, why is there not a rule against that? I mean,
well, I'm dismayed by it too. I mean, I know that the multinational tax avoidance stuff that I've done, people are sick of this. People are sick of seeing profits from Australian enterprise siphoned off to tax havens, particularly when there are politicians involved. And particularly with privatisations, like Energy Australia is the flagship, the bellwether. You know, here's one of the big three electricity, gas, power generation companies in Australia. It bills 1/3 of people in Australia, yet it hasn't paid tax in years on dozens of billions of dollars of income. Its parent is in the British Virgin Islands, which is even more notorious than the Cayman Islands. So the money goes back there. You know, jet loading, these kind of typical, you know, sort of multinational tax rorts to get the money out of Australia before you have to pay tax on them, loans to themselves and so on. I mean, these things are, you know, people are sick of this stuff. And there has to be some government action on it. There has been some government action. It's a slow process. There's a lot of money in tax avoidance, and that just has to continue.
Yeah, that's right. And to me, one of the biggest issues around this is the fact that so much of this behaviour is actually, strictly speaking, not illegal. Much of it is in the grey zone, but the vast majority of this tax avoidance is actually a function of dysfunctional regulation and legislation. And that, I see that as one of the biggest problems, that there are actually solutions here, but no one in the corprocracy are actually addressing it or are too scared to address it.
Well, the more complex the laws are, the easier it is to dodge them, and the more people make money out of them, because you need more advice from the big four accounting firms, more advice from the big law firms, the taxpayer partners in the big law firms. So it's a fee fest, and there is no political will to change the tax laws in any significant way. So they'll continue to be exploited. But when you say it's a grey zone, it's the companies say there's 3 points of view. A lot of people just say, look, it's just basically immoral. A lot of it's illegal. Other people, the corporates say, no, it's all legal. We act within the law. Of course, we wouldn't break the law. We've had legal advice from the best lawyers. And then there's the grey zone perspective. The grey zone is the correct perspective, because when you talk to tax lawyers, they'll tell you that a lot of stuff sails close to the wind, that, you know, on one view of it, it might be illegal. On another view, I mean, if you're lending money to yourself from overseas, like Chevron was pinged for, the big oil major, they're lending money to themselves in Australia from overseas at 1%. And they were jacking up the price and charging 9%. So that huge profit from lending to themselves raked out all the money in Australia and sent it back to New York or wherever their head office is. So the question becomes, at what point is it illegal to take a commercial margin on top? You take, is it 9% from 1%? Is it 6% from 1%? Because 9% is obviously ridiculous, the tax office threw the book at them. Or is it 3%? And therein lies the problem, because the law will say you're allowed to make a commercial return, cover your costs. But what are your costs? How can your costs be manipulated? It's all about manipulating costs and changing the shape of money. So it's all in the grey area, a lot of it. And when people say we're obeying the law, it depends how you interpret the law, because it's a big game played by the whole fraternity.
That's right. And so, unfortunately, being unethical is often not illegal, which is a big part of the problem. I mean, a lot of it is a cultural problem, isn't it? What are some of the other stories you've covered recently on michaelwest.com.au? Well,
I've done a lot of work on poker machines with a forensic accountant contact of mine. I'm just going to turn on the light here, Kim. And as it turns out, you know, we found evidence of the biggest clubs in the biggest gambling sector, which is poker machines in New South Wales, is the biggest gambling sector in the world, not in terms of sheer dollars, but in terms of per person. So poker machines are a real problem. They cause suicide and so on, family distress. We have to clean up the social fallout and dislocation from this. You know, the charity groups that have to deal with this costs to society. Governments are getting about 25% out of it, state governments, so they are completely addicted to the revenue and unwilling to do anything realistic to curb the problem. And it's uneconomic. I mean, it's people wasting time in front of a useless screen. It's not recreational in most cases in terms of most revenue. Obviously, these people, it's an addiction for a lot of them. Some people can control it and it's just a bit of fun. Fortunately, that's not the case. So we found that we did 10 years of financial accounts, and we did some metrics around the amount of money they give to the community, because the big thing is from the clubs, we give all this money. You know, it's poker machines, okay, they're not great, that's the underlying narrative, but we give all this money, we help sporting teams and we help local things. We have our Anzac Day service and we, you know, whatever it is, whether it's an RSL club or the Catholic club or the Workers Club or the Rugby League club. It's a community thing, they say. Well, we did some numbers per member, and we found that the average on $11.5 billion in poker machine profits, that's not turnover, only 2.2% went to community. So they can't be fair income, can they? Because 25% went to state governments. The rest, I mean, you have a look at these clubs, they're empire building. A lot of them own 40 properties in the, you know, in the area in which they operate. And we did some corporate governance stuff. It's the vast majority of directors are, you know, men in their 60s and 70s. 8% are female, compared to 30% on ASX boards.
8%.
8% only are female and directors. I mean, if you open up any of these, you know, it's like, you know, it's, I hate to be ageist, but, you know, it's not a matter of, you know, old people, and you've got to have experience. You also should have diversity, because club patrons aren't just men. If you compare that to women on the boards in the ASX, that's about 30%. So it's all white, Anglo-Irish men predominantly.
Yeah. Having experienced firsthand both drug addiction and gambling addiction in my family, I don't know which is worse, but you used the word addiction, and it very much is an addiction. And as you said, state governments in particular are addicted to the money that comes from it. Now, as a writer, I'm sure I share with many others the frustration of writing about issues such as this, and in my case, trying to focus on solutions and reform, only to find often that it kind of all seems too hard. So what do you think we as in those of us who see so much of the wrongdoing, the corruption, the tax evasion, and the exploitation of weak governance, what else can we do? What else should we do?
Well, if they say that anxiety is worrying about things which you can't change, there are a lot of people out there, and you can see it on Twitter, who suffer anxiety because rightfully they're frustrated with the fact that our politicians are not serving the community which elected them. Not all of them. A lot of them are very good. A lot of them are, it's not a black and white thing either. There's good and bad in all people. So I think to be strident and ideological and tribal about it politically doesn't really help. But there's great disaffection out there, and I try not to, in my job, because you're always looking at gigantic rorts, some of which you can't publish because there are defamation issues. You really have to look at it objectively and not get sucked into this view that it's all bad, it's all terrible, But things do change, and I've seen it change with the multinational tax avoidance. This is a big racket. It's the biggest racket in the world. We're talking about the biggest institutions in the world. 30% in Australia is meant to be paid from their profits to the government in income tax. Many pay zero. So we're talking about billions and billions of dollars, sometimes per company, if they're big enough. So it's the biggest racket in the world. So much money behind it. But there was change. The politicians got onto it. They had a Senate inquiry in 2015. The government was forced to enact some reforms, and $5 odd billion has come through the door since then. And the ATO people will confide in you that there's been behavioural changes. Communities' expectations change. So this happens with community pressure. So the first step is community awareness, driven hopefully by media, because that's what we're meant to do. Unfortunately, there's a lot of captive media, but first thing is community awareness. Once there's community awareness and community outcry, that affects the decisions that politicians make. They sniff the wind, and then comes action. And community standards change. And now there's a view that people should be pulling their weight. Companies are aware of this. The big four audit firms that are really part of the problem in all this, big four accounting firms, they're telling their clients, this is a reputational issue for you now. It's a reputational issue for us. For some reason, the media's left them well alone. They're the most powerful institutions in the world, but you won't read anybody except on my website. Occasionally somebody at the Fin Review will have a crack, but it's all nicely, it's not particularly robust, not off the front page. So you've got very few people having a go there, but that will come. That will come. You can't have four institutions that are the most powerful in the world growing 10% revenue every year, taking over government, whole departments being outsourced to them, without some kind of public understanding and outcry. So that'll happen at some point. So community awareness, political action, change. Standards change. So there will be changes. Unfortunately, the overall view on corporatocracy is a problem, I think, because corporations have increasingly got power, and that is a threat to democracy.
Yes, it certainly is. It certainly is. Very early in my business career, I worked for what was then called Arthur Andersen, which later became Andersen and then became Accenture. But even then, now almost 40 years ago, I saw firsthand some of those behaviours, and in particular how it is all about who you know and when you know them and in what situation you can impact on a certain decision, whether it's in government or within business. I want to come back to just for a moment. You mentioned defamation laws earlier, Can you elaborate a bit more on that and tell us how that impacts on how you approach your writing and publishing, and maybe also what do you think needs to happen with our defamation laws?
Well, the problem is people say if you're telling the truth, you're okay. But that's not correct. And I've been threatened for things which I thought were true, and that doesn't stop lawyers having a crack at you. I've also been dragged through the courts in an action. Macquarie Bank took a defamation action many years ago. God bless them, because they really did some good public relations work for me there, because we won that lawsuit after 2 or 3 years, but it was a $3 or $5 million spend. Now, you know, that's well beyond the ordinary person. So, you know, a media company versus a bank. Now, if I'd been fighting that on my own right at the moment, how would I have gone? Would I have scraped the $3 to $5 million? Because you would have been faced with a security for costs order. Well, actually, if you're taking the action, so let's say you're the defendant, it doesn't matter whether it's true. They can pepper you with legal letters and make your life a misery and effectively scare you. This is the tactic, and it happens all the time. I get people coming to me, oh, I've been threatened by a lawyer. You know, you see it in the mainstream media, you see how timid they are when it comes to certain subjects and certain people. I can read a story now in a newspaper or online and work out probably whether it's been legaled or not, because for 20 years I had all my copy poured over by the in-house lawyers who I'm very good friends with at these institutions before they ran. Now, people are less likely to have a crack at an independent operator because there's no money there generally. They can bully them to try to get them to pull a story, and that happens all the time. But if that person goes public, then they magnify their problem. And I think, and I've had a couple, since I've been operating on my own, I've had a couple of threats, and I've just publicised them immediately. I've done, in one case, I did what was reasonable under the defamation laws to ameliorate their concerns, and then said, look, if you keep on bullying me, I'm just going to go public. That was so the defamation fraternity is quite small. They know that if you know what you're talking about and you stand up to them, they risk what we call the Streisand effect, where Barbara Streisand complained about a small, criticism from a local newspaper somewhere, and it became a global news story. So the Streisand effect is a risk. And lawyers, of course, make money either way, so it's not a risk for them, but they should be telling their clients that there is a risk that if they run around bullying people, that this will be magnified into a bigger story, and that happens.
So just in closing, Michael, anything you can share about any upcoming stories or revelations?
Well, I do have an absolute beauty coming, and it was supposed to be here. We're going to chat about it today, Kim, but unfortunately I'm doing it in conjunction with a television network that has a very large mainstream media bureaucracy. And either they've got cold feet, or they've got a legal problem, or somebody's tapping them or something. And I can't really give away what it is because it's very sensitive, but it is to do with China. And this issue of Chinese corporate and political power is an issue for every country in the world, of course. I don't have a particularly ideological view on this, but I think that, you know, it definitely has to be watched. And so I've got a very good China story involving a media organisation, the Australian government, and a few other things, and hopefully it'll get a run very shortly. And so I'm looking forward to that.
We'll look forward to that. Well, thank you, Michael. This has been really interesting, and thank you for everyone who's been watching. The recording of this will be available later today on our YouTube channel at theIndependents, and on your preferred social media channel, of course. You can find Michael's in mind on michaelwest.com.au. And make sure you follow him and dozens of other independent media sources on theindependents.org.au. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Kim. Good to be on the show.
Thanks, everyone.